Welcome back to Project 10. It's Cormac Moore here. And just before we kick off this episode, two quick things. Firstly, if it is your first time listening, you're very welcome. But if you've been waiting since the last episode, I just want to say thank you for your patience. These episodes can take some time, but I would personally rather give you something that I feel is ready and of a certain quality rather than something that might be a bit rushed. Delays can happen for the strangest of reasons. And to give you an example, this episode was set back a couple of weeks because one of the people was in Mexico City during the earthquakes there, and another person was affected by the forest fires that are currently taking place in LA. Again, everyone is all right in those situations, but they just knocked the episodes back a couple of weeks. So again, thank you for your patience just in relation to that. Also, I'd quickly like to let you know that there's now a Patreon account set up for the series. If you don't know what Patreon is, it is a way for people to support podcasts and online content that they like to help contribute to the cost of things like production, research, marketing, and help keep it independent and free from a ton of advertising. So if you would like to support Project 10 and you're enjoying what you're hearing so far, you can get all the details about how you can contribute on patreon.com/Project 10. Everyone who does support the series on Patreon gets the full episodes before everyone else and also gets bonus content, including things like extended interviews with the guests that have featured so far. If you'd like to, that'd be hugely appreciated, and you can do so over at patreon.com/Project 10. Now, on with the show. Is your job and your livelihood going to be taken away by artificial intelligence, robotics, and automation? Is there any profession that's actually safe from the infringing technologies? And what do you and I need to do to make sure that we don't get left behind in an ever-changing and advancing world? Featuring on this episode to discuss those exact questions.
The short answer is the fearmongers, there is a kernel of truth to it.
That's Paul Roehrig. He's the Chief Strategy Officer for Cognizant's digital business organization.
And then as we dug into it, we realized that we actually were feeling more and more uneasy about many of the pieces of technology that we were looking at and seeing as being things that were coming in the future.
That is Alex Salkever. He is the former Vice President of Marketing for Mozilla and best-selling technology author. Dr. Heather Knight also joins us. She is the woman who created the world's first robotic stand-up comedian.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely reasons to be scared.
And Dr. Irving Wladasky-Berger.
Is it true that many people are finding harder to get jobs? Absolutely. And a number of people have lost jobs because of automation, and if they don't have the proper skills, it's hard for them to adapt to the new job. And we're talking about millions of people.
He spent 37 years working in IBM and is a visiting professor at MIT to share his thoughts about whether or not we should be worried about the fears, dangers, and opportunities that automation, AI, and robotics will bring. And those fears have always been lurking in the background of our culture. The idea of machines uprising against their human overlords. They're often featured and exaggerated in sci-fi movies. We've seen those fears explored in Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We had man and machine merging in RoboCop.
Drop the gun, you are under arrest.
And arguably the most famous movie about the robot apocalypse, Terminator.
I'll be back.
All those are just movies, but when people like Elon Musk, the founder of SpaceX and a pioneer in autonomous driving technology, come out and say things like this.
I think we should be very careful about artificial intelligence. If I were to guess at what our biggest existential threat is, it's probably that. So we need to be very careful with artificial intelligence. We are summoning the demon.
People are understandably starting to grow nervous. It is not just your job, but your entire existence at risk. Those thoughts are presumably extreme, but those comments are on the back of several international reports that highlight the dangers automation may bring to the workforce. For example, the World Economic Forum published a report on automation that suggested that between now and 2020, up to 5 million jobs in 15 developed countries could be lost to automation. And it's in fact worse in developing countries. The International Labour Organization released a report in July of 2016 about the impact automation will have on a number of Asian economies. 56% of workers from Cambodia, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam are at high risk of being replaced by automation. Their calculations suggest that that's about 137 million people. So is there a legitimate reason for you and I to be worried? Addressing that question first, direct from Silicon Valley, is Alex Salkever. He's the former Vice President of Marketing for Mozilla. He's a consultant to a number of top tech firms and has co-authored the best-selling book, The Driver in the Driverless Car. The book was long-listed by the Financial Times and McKinsey's Best Business Book of 2017. And he started off by telling me how his views on the future world of automation changed while he was writing and researching the book.
In this particular case, we were trying to write a book, or we're thinking about what kind of books we could write about the future of technology. And initially, this started out as almost a super positive book, talking about how everything would be wonderful. And then as we dug into it, we realized that we actually were feeling more and more uneasy about many of the pieces of technology that we were looking at and seeing as being things that were coming in the future. And so we started to take a little more nuanced view, and we also asked a bunch of our friends about the technologies that we were writing about, and it made many of them uneasy as well. Things like driverless cars, very affordable genomic sequencing, drones, artificial intelligence, robots. And these are all things that, because we live in Silicon Valley or close to it, we see them happen a little faster than probably people in the rest of the world and the rest of the country do. And so that really spawned the idea for the book.
Yeah, so your book is called The Driver and the Driverless Car, and in it you talk about the two possible future outcomes for the world. One is the utopian Star Trek world where nobody wants for anything. The other is the dystopian Mad Max type world. Could we talk a little bit about the Mad Max type world, what that could look like and how we could wind up getting there?
I'll change that very slightly. When we wrote the book, it was the Mad Max. Mad Max was the analogy. I think today, because Blade Runner just came out a couple weeks ago, it might be an even better film analogy. Because rather than a civilization that's destroyed and living out in the Australian outback, it'd be more like an urban civilization or lots and lots of people living in a world of real inequality, of haves and have-nots, where there's essentially two different existences, one for people who have money and people that have power, and the other for people that don't. And it sounds similar to some of the ways the world works today, but we envision it as being perhaps worse over time. And the reason we started to think about that is because the benefits of technology could accrue unevenly and unfavorably to a select group. And I'll give you a specific example, which you could actually look at in Blade Runner. When you look at something like genetic enhancements to human beings, right now we can't do a whole lot with that, but we probably will be able to in the next 10, 20, 25 years. And initially it probably will cost some money. So then we might be setting up a situation when people that have money can ensure that their children have a better chance and are perhaps have a better chance of being more intelligent. And not only will their children have that, it'll be passed on to their children's children. So you start to see generational effects of inequality. And granted, those already exist to a certain degree today, but they could be accelerated and amplified by technology. Another example around that is when you look at algorithms that describe us, and we all are described by algorithms, make no mistake. And when you apply for a loan for a house or a car, or when you go try to get a job, or when you go to the doctor, in almost all these places, an algorithm will touch you. As these systems become more and more autonomous and write their own code and set their own rules, the biases that were created actually they were part of the creators of the systems, they get baked into the algorithms and the autonomous systems, and then they can self-perpetuate. And this can make it harder and harder for, say, people that maybe have less money or have a shorter job history or live in the wrong part of the world or don't have the right color of their skin to get a loan or to get financial services or to get a good price on something they buy from Amazon. And this, once it's baked into the system and the system is not transparent, because algorithmic systems generally aren't, we don't know what's happening inside of them as consumers, and in fact often the scientists themselves don't know, then you have this very deep institutional bias, which is a technological bias that is self-perpetuating as the systems write themselves over and over again.
With regard to artificial intelligence and automation, a worst-case scenario, what could be the impact on the future of jobs?
A worst-case scenario, I think we'll see accelerated replacement of people with robots. I don't think it's going to be incredibly fast because governments do move fairly slowly on this, but people move slowly too. So it's very hard for people to change and adapt. So I think in certain sectors, we will see a lot more robots out in the workforce, particularly in areas where it's something that is a dangerous job or a job that is very routine or a job that really looks at matching patterns or could be described in recipes. In many cases, automation will replace pieces of jobs and become better than humans at those. So an example we often give is in radiology, for example. Machines should be better at matching patterns and seeing precancerous growth on X-rays and imaging than humans are over time. But that also might mean that the doctors or the technicians spend less time trying to look at images and more time talking to people and helping them with their care or helping them understand what's happening to them. So it's not necessarily clear that there's going to be mass job disruption, but we think that over the next I'd say 5 years is too short. 10 to 20 is when you'll start to see a lot of changes in this direction. And that's where I think it will be pretty scary for a lot of people.
A famous study has also been used to frighten us about the worst case scenario that could be coming. In 2013, a study was published by Oxford University entitled The Future of Employment: How Susceptible Are Jobs to Computerization? The research was compiled by Dr. Carl Benedict Frey and Dr. Michael Osborne, and in the abstract, one of their findings concluded, and I quote, about 47% of total US employment is at risk. Again, this added to the panic with numerous terrifying articles appearing online with headlines such as "Robots will steal your job," that was from the Business Insider. "The robot debate is over, the jobs are gone and they're not coming back," which was published by The Guardian. And 47% of all jobs will be automated by 2034 and no government is prepared. And that was by the Huffington Post. However, not everyone agrees with those sentiments, and one such person is Paul Roehrig. Paul is the Chief Strategy Officer for Cognizant's digital business. Cognizant is a Fortune 500 company. It's one of the leading professional service companies in the world that works with clients to improve and innovate their business into the digital age. He is also the co-author of the best-selling book, What to Do When Machines Do Everything. And I asked him what he thought about all this fear-mongering and worry about automation stealing jobs.
The short answer is the fear-mongers, there is a kernel of truth to it, but it's been blown out of proportion. If the work that someone's doing is data-intensive, highly routinized, and doesn't really require things that humans do well, things like having curiosity or empathy, being able to relate to others well, then there is a chance that a job could be automated away. But most knowledge work isn't that simple. Pick a doctor or lawyer. There are things that can be routinized and supported by the new machine, but a vast majority of the job really requires things that humans do well. The ability to ask a good question, the ability to relate to someone, communicate complex information, create, have new ideas. Those are things that machines don't do well now and won't be able to do well anytime soon.
In your book and some of the interviews, you mentioned that famous 2013 Oxford study that said 40 to 50% of the labour force could be automated within the next number of years. Do you think that's completely untrue?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. It's actually quite a good study. But the headline that came on the back of the study is a little bit overblown, I would say. So what they said was that a lot of work can be automated. My read of that study didn't suggest that they said, this is going to lead to wholesale destruction of the global economy. What they said was that a lot of work can be automated at the job and task level. And that's where one of the things in putting together the book, one of the things we did was look at all the different studies. And in fact, in addition to the research that we conducted on our own, to try and figure out what were the more likely scenarios around work and machines. When you do that, you have to get down to, again, the task level. So every job is made up of a lot of different things. Some of those things can be automated. Some of those things can be enhanced. And that gives you a much different kind of broader view of how the world is going to play out with jobs and machines. And the other thing that is often overlooked is the notion of new job growth. And there, when the calculations get done, sometimes that's just left out of the equation. But historically, when you look at times of big shifts in business and technology and society, there in every major case that we've been able to identify, there was a growth of jobs that couldn't have been predicted at the moment of invention. So unless we're breaking history, and we don't think we are, then the future for those who are prepared is not necessarily this dystopian nightmare that's sometimes portrayed.
So there always has been an increase in jobs with new technology over time. And as Paul mentioned, this has happened to us before. Here is MIT's Dr. Irving Wladasky-Berger speaking about that.
The best way to understand an unpredictable future is to look back at history. So let's look at where we've been coming from. And through the Industrial Revolution of the past 200 years, there have been some pretty big transformations that in their own times people viewed as being as revolutionary as what we are going through. And I'm sure your listeners are familiar with the Luddites in England in the early 19th century that were really worried that the new steam power technologies, the looms that were used to make textiles, displaced them. And the Luddites rebelled against it, destroyed a number of these new machines because they were worried that they would lose their jobs. Now, the reality is a number of them lost their jobs initially, but as I've read many times, if you look 20, 30 years later, the textiles exploded because the productivity and the quality that the new machines made possible made it far, far easier to create all kinds of textiles. And so the number of people working in the textile industry went way up. So that was almost the first time we saw that in the early stages of a technology-based revolution, a number of people will be left behind and will lose their job. But in the long term, the same technology revolution will create whole new industries and whole new jobs.
So we've always rebounded in the long term and created more jobs. But what then do people do in those years of transition? What does a taxi driver or a truck driver do for the rest of their life when they're put out of work by driverless cars? If it can take 10, 20, 30 years for the full transition to take place? I asked Alex that question.
It's a really hard question. I mean, first of all, we don't know what the jobs of the future will look like. If you looked at job descriptions 100 years ago, many of the jobs that we have today don't appear in them. Those jobs didn't exist. For an example that I read about in medicine, just to keep on that thread, you did not have CAT scan technicians or MRI technicians 100 years ago because MRIs and CAT scans didn't exist. So new technologies have ways of creating new jobs, but with something like truck drivers or taxi drivers where essentially the job category is disappearing wholesale, there's a very difficult transition period where you have to re-educate, you have to learn new skills, you have to maybe open a business, or you just don't adjust. And I think you see that a lot in the U.S. right now, where you're probably familiar that life expectancy is going down among certain groups of Americans. And that's probably a symptom of this inability to transfer into a newer economy. And so it can be very scary and very hard and very difficult.
One of the things that's been mentioned already is that new industries have always created new jobs. But one thing I've always wondered is that with automation, AI, and robotics, will those newly created industries, jobs, and tasks just be done by the robots anyway? Paul Roehrig has an answer on that, which we'll get to in a minute. But before that, I just want to talk about something else. Already you've heard that it's just highly routinized jobs that are most at risk. The jobs that require a more human element of creativity and curiosity are safe and will be for the immediate future. However, robots are already starting to creep into and replace jobs you'd think could only be done by humans. Take, for example, journalism. Financial reporting is now being done by software since it's primarily a job of just comparing numbers and data. For the last number of years, the Associated Press has teamed up with Automated Insights, a company that built article writing software. In 2015, it was rolling out 3,000 articles per quarter. In an interview with TheVerge.com, Automated Insights spokesperson James Kochi said that their system could in fact produce 2,000 articles per second if needs be. Now, financial writing doesn't need a lot of creativity or passion or human interest, but sports writing is also being automated, since that is basically just comparing numbers, performances, and trends too. But the systems are actually getting better. Take, for example, this paragraph about a baseball game, and I quote, "Things looked bleak for the Angels when they trailed by 2 runs in the 9th inning, but Los Angeles recovered thanks to a key single from Vladimir Guerrero to pull out a 7-6 victory over the Boston Red Sox at Fenway Park on Sunday." That article was written entirely by a piece of software. A company called StatsMonkey has trained its software to write in a fashion similar to that of an actual sports writer. And going even further, comedians are being automated and roboticized. The world's first stand-up comedy robot was unveiled at a TED Talk in 2011. And invented by Dr. Heather Knight. How does it work and why does she create it? I'll let her explain.
So I am a social roboticist, so I design robots that can interact with people, and so we kind of have to understand people in order to make robots effectively do that. I have been working on robots on and off for the past 16 years. Anyway, it's an exciting time because when I started, this idea of having these character-based robots was very sci-fi, and it still kind of is. But now there are actual companies starting that are, making security robots for malls or when we have autonomous mobile robots in factories, and there's just a lot of exciting stuff.
So you invented the world's first stand-up robotic comedian. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to invent a robotic comedian?
So one of the things about making robots for people is you have to spend a lot of time actually evaluating them with people. So we do these things called user studies where you invite 15, 20 50 people one at a time individually over the course of a couple of weeks to evaluate things. And I thought it would be a whole lot more efficient if I could just make something that was exciting enough that people would want to just come to a theater and collect all of that data at once. So there were two things. One is it's like I thought that making robots more entertaining could make for a way of doing research that was more fun both for me and for the people that were help giving feedback. But then I think there's also just this inherently interesting thing about performers where, like human performers, you really have to think about creating something that people care about or that matters to them or that evokes some kind of emotion. And that's a lot of what I was trying to do already, just not in quite the same language. So I think I just can learn a lot from performers in general. So putting a robot on stage was a great way to start that conversation.
For people who haven't seen your robot data perform, can you tell us a little bit about how exactly it works and how it uses feedback from the crowd to tailor its own performance?
Sure. I guess there are two types of sensing. So the initial performance, because comedy it's not so much formulaic, but it's kind of predictable. You know, if you have a big punchline, you would expect the laughter to happen right after that point. So basically, the robot would tell a joke, and then it samples the audio, which just means it listens to whether you laugh. So, I mean, laughter and applause. And actually, we thought we were going to have to do something more complicated, but volume, just like how loud the laughter and applause is, a really good indicator of whether people are reacting or enjoying or, like disgusted or whatever, because emotion is sort of what you're going for in comedy. So if you're evoking a response. So that was the kind of semi-voluntary one, because you laugh, it's partially on purpose and it's partially, just like it kind of takes you over. And then I also gave them feedback cards, so they could just flip these little paddles over. One side was red and one side was green. And so there was a camera that was we would just estimate the ratio of red to green. So they're kind of oppositional colors.
I've watched some of your talks where you mention it changes its performance or its jokes on the audience reaction. Does it know the age of the audience, or does it scan for that, or how does it know and how does it make that decision?
Oh, okay, yeah, the original algorithm. It does not. So basically what was happening there is we had a database of 200 jokes, and each of them was labeled along some kind of attribute scale. So how long is the joke, how intellectual is the joke, how appropriate is the joke. I forget, there were 5 in total. And so it was more like Netflix. So it was just being you seem to like jokes that have a strong female lead, and so it was actually only paying attention to just their response. So, I mean, it's not actually true, but there's, some people hope that in the future, at least go to more algorithmic things could be less biased because they're just treating every person as the same. It doesn't always work that way. But yeah, at least in this particular case, it literally is ignoring your face and only looking for that red-green pixels and for that volume of your laughter.
So Data, the robotic comedian, is responsive to its audience. It isn't writing its own jokes, but in the 6 years since it was created, AI has started to develop the ability to think for itself and learn on its own. And we have seen that when AI for the first time beat a human in the board game Go. Go is a game played on a 19 by 19 square board, where the objective of the game is to capture your opponent's pieces and capture the most amount of space on the board. All the pieces are the same, one player's is black and one is white, and it's considered by many to be far more complex than chess, so people didn't think AI would be able to defeat a human for many, many years to come. To compare just how complex, after the first 2 moves in a game of chess, there are about 400 possible next moves. After the first 2 moves in Go, there are over 130,000 possible next moves. So when Google's AI machine beat a human for the first time, and numerous times since, including world champions, it sparked a lot of interest.
It was really interesting. So the Go machine, which is called DeepMind, and it actually was a UK startup that was purchased by Google. The leading experts in artificial intelligence didn't think that a computer would be able to beat a human at Go for at least another 5 to 10 years. So they were very surprised at the outcome. Not only did DeepMind beat the human by understanding all the things that the human was doing and playing better Go, what surprised the scientists so much was when DeepMind started to put in place some moves that humans didn't recognize, human Go experts didn't understand and really didn't know where they came from. And those were moves that the computer essentially figured out itself. And this is something in the book we talk about called emergent intelligence, emergent artificial intelligence. And that's where the systems start to teach themselves things that humans couldn't teach them easily. And this is a very simple and narrow example in Go. This is not an example of broad AI that can truly replace human capabilities like curiosity. It's not a general capability. You can't take the same system that beats humans at Go and tell it to then go beat people at Monopoly. It wouldn't know how to do that. But the fact that within what is a very complex game and essentially an art form, that it can come up with really original ideas gives some hints that perhaps in the future the systems will have many of the capabilities which right now we think are primarily reserved for humans. And frankly, around the edges, we already see computers starting to nibble at some of these things. So one example, there's a startup where if you want to compose a score for your advertisement, you can tell it a couple songs that you like, describe the mood you want to create, and the system will generate maybe 10 or 20 different musical compositions for your ad. And then you can go pick the one that you like. And they're not bad. They're not Mozart or Beethoven, but they're perfectly serviceable for what had been a very creative profession.
So journalism, comedy, music, complex board games are all seeing automation creep in. The human jobs are already starting to see robots impact them. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, one of the things I thought was, are all of these new industries and new jobs that are created just going to be done by more robotics, more AI, and more automation? And would companies not prefer to just hire robots over workers? Is that idea right or overly pessimistic? Let's jump back in and listen to what Paul Roehrig thinks.
I think it's overly pessimistic. I think if you look, for example, just take one example that we talk about, which is we all know of the television industry and the movie industry. Since the invention of the motion picture, that has created an entirely new industry. And there's a huge amount of jobs that comprise what we call the motion picture and television industry. There are studios and actors and so on and so forth. But all of those could never have been imagined at the moment of invention when the Lumiere brothers figured out, how do we make a picture look like it's moving? And so I just think it's just a lack of imagination to conclude that that's not going to happen with, for example, AR and VR, where Wells Fargo came out with a study that suggested that in just a few years, the AR and VR market will surpass in overall volume the television and motion picture market. And you can look at lots of different technologies where the expectation is starting to emerge that there's a huge amount of growth in aggregate, but is often underreported when we talk about AI is going to completely erode jobs and erode the middle class.
I think some people think that business owners, not that they hate employees, but they're one of the biggest expense and the most complicated expense. Our business is not going to be more incentivized, just even financially, to replace humans with robots because of the increased productivity and the lack of stress and worry. And, robots aren't going to unionize and take down the factory. You know what I mean? So I suppose people's fear, is the fact that companies see them as a massive expense and as a liability in many ways, as opposed to a robot.
Yeah, absolutely. And we hear that as well. But it goes back to where we started, which is, what do people do well and what do machines do well? And we are, the fact of the matter is, and this is a painful truth, that if somebody or a group of somebodies is doing work that is highly data intensive, routinized, it's automatable. If that's all you're doing, then that is a cost that responsible managers need to take a hard look at. But like I said, most most knowledge work jobs are comprised of much more than just that. So I don't buy the conclusion that managers and leaders of large organizations are kind of anti-human. I think the responsible stewardship requires looking at ways to maximize return. That's part of the rules of the game, if you will. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's anti-human. If all somebody is doing is highly routinized work, then that does become an area where cost cutting absolutely will happen. But again, the more likely scenario is that AI is deployed as a productivity improvement tool. So there is the automation side, but like we talk about in the book, more jobs will become what we call enhanced. So people will be able to use tools to do their work better. And that's a trend that, again, that's happened throughout history. As tools improve, productivity improves. And you mentioned agriculture. It used to be there weren't tools, right? It used to be there wasn't a wheel. And all the way back, thousands and thousands of years ago, those technologies have made humans more productive. And this is really this is really no different.
I put the same question to Dr. Heather Knight about companies moving towards full automation and whether we should be scared or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's absolutely reasons to be scared. What's sort of interesting, so I'm actually teaching an ethics and computer science class this term, so, in half an hour, that's where I'll be running off to. It's interesting because how we integrate technology in society is in part what the technology actually is, and it's in part what the society actually is. So, I actually was grading student papers the other day, and someone was writing that the problem isn't robots, it's capitalism. It really just goes straight to it. It's just if you are actually partnering people with the machines and letting them reap some of the benefits and the productivity increases that those machines can actually impart, which, for example, a company like Volkswagen has been trying to do in their factories. They're increasing on automation, but they're also trying to do that in partnership with the workers that are already there. But whereas you saw a lot of other companies, big companies, maybe 10 years ago when there was an economic downturn that fired a lot of people, got some automation, and then when they started making more money and they could have afforded to hire people, they're actually, we kind of like just having robots. That's a choice that's coming from economics and from this kind of widening gap between the rich and poor and the disappearance of the middle class, which sure, technology might be enabling that, but it's not the only cause, right? So I think that the good thing about there being these economic structures that are, I think, contributing to this is that there could be policies, economic policies, or political change, or even just kind of awareness that could shift. But so that's one answer. And another hope that I have going forward is I think that the push we're in robotics innovation right now is not just automation. It's more about partnership. So you have maybe you broke a limb and you have to do a lot of physical therapy exercises to get the power of that limb back. And so you still have the human doctor that you see maybe once every week or two, but then you could also bring home this little desktop robot that helps you track your exercises and does them at the same time with you, and that sort of social companionship could make you keep to doing those exercises better, because that's just how we're built. We always do things better with friends or with social characters. So I like the idea of partnering people in technology, and I think that's my hope of where innovation is going.
Do you think that there's a real concern that long-term companies and corporations are going to prefer to just invest in robots and automation than humans?
So I've been learning more about factory robots. We have a collaboration with this Canadian company, ClearPath, that does automated mobile robots in factories so they can move things around. And what was really interesting is we went to visit this one factory outside of Toronto, and they had gone as much as they could completely automated in 1989, and they were seeking to integrate these more intelligent robots with people, basically because automation is really inflexible. It seemed like it was really helpful, and it was for a couple decades, but now it's kind of limiting because robots aren't that flexible. Even in factories, the hot topic right now is collaborative manufacturing. In fact, most cars are 50% put together by people and 50% by robots, and they kind of are in these different spaces. So all the big parts where they press the side of the metal and they paint it and they anodize it or whatever it is, they do that with robots. And then it sort of passes to the human side and they install the seats and they do the wiring because we're just a lot more dexterous than machines are. The thing right now that people are really excited about is why do we have to keep them in completely separate spaces? Are there ways to be even more efficient by combining what the people can do and what people are good at and what robots are good at, but also making it safe to be in the same space? So it's kind of funny because, I didn't even think about that as being a possibility, but even manufacturing is moving more of the way of these kind of human-robot teams.
So we don't have to be too scared of the future anyway.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm more scared of people than robots. And not socially, just sort of in terms of values. So
maybe the future isn't going to be a horrible dystopian jobless future at the mercy of our robot captors. We could be their companions and their partners in the workplace. The future mightn't be so bad. Here's what Dr. Irving Wladasky-Berger thinks.
The techno-pessimist would say, okay, Irving, it's all over. That this time is different from the technology revolutions in the Industrial Revolution. These machines don't just make up for our quote-unquote physical deficiencies. These machines are going at what makes us human, at our cognitive capabilities, our intelligence. So this time it's different. Robotics, artificial intelligence, etc. It's going to be bad. Those are the techno-pessimists. The techno-optimists, and I put myself in this camp, feel that humans will adapt just like we have been doing for the past 250 years, let me say. It will take time, but once more we will adapt to the new technologies and we will coexist with them. The one thing that is absolutely critical is more skills and education. In every time there is one of these revolutions, the requirements for skills and education to be able to get a good job go way up.
So if you and I are to move towards a better future where our AI, robotics and automation enhance our jobs and our daily lives, what do we need to do now to ensure that we move to that future? Alex has an idea.
We touch on that a bit in the book as well, and we frame it really in 3 questions that we want people to ask about all these technologies coming around them. And these are basic questions that we hope people can think through as they hold their leaders, the technology companies like Google, Facebook, accountable for some of the things they're creating. And the 3 questions very simply are, does the technology have the potential to benefit everyone equally, or will it create inequality? What are the risks and rewards of that technology? And does the technology promote autonomy or dependence? And these are just 3 questions that over time we thought would be a good way to make people think very hard before adopting, because at the core of this, and maybe this is too much to ask because people to date have not really become very involved educationally in deciding what technologies should and should not be used, but they have their best interests in mind. And in some places, governments are doing a pretty good job with this. In Europe, for example, some of the things they're doing with data privacy, data protection are very consumer friendly. And I know governments are thinking very hard about the impacts of driverless cars, personal genomics, robots and drones. But we as people really do need to be involved in a lot of these decisions because it's our world. And even if the governments represent us, that doesn't mean that they aren't competing with other forces that maybe will want things to go in a different direction. So, I mean, really, it's about us being better educated citizens and understanding all of these technologies far better than we do today, and not in a preachy way. I'm not saying everybody needs to, spend a lot of time going back to school, getting a computer science degree. But at the same time, it's a good idea, for us to understand when we see a drone flying over, what are the implications on privacy? Is it okay for someone to shoot a drone down, which in the U.S. people are actually doing when the drones fly over their backyard swimming pools? So, I mean, just many of these kind of questions like that. It really is because as the future moves faster, we as humans are not going to adapt faster automatically. We have to force ourselves a little bit to learn more, to learn faster, to become more immersed, to really learn. Because it's sort of the core learning from all of this is that for a long time we've said everyone needs to continue learning for their whole lives if they want to do well in the world. And it's much more important now than it was 100 years ago.
So after hearing everyone so far, what are your thoughts? Which side are you falling on? Are you a techno-optimist or a techno-pessimist? I don't know if it's the Irish in me, but I'm leaning more towards the pessimistic side. At least in the short term when a lot of jobs are going to be displaced. I mean, robots just seem far more attractive for employers, don't they? No office politics, no sick days, no maternity leave, no breaks, no unions, no injuries, no Christmas party affairs, no jealousies over promotions, no annual leave, no procrastination, no failed deadlines, no hangovers. Just a workforce constantly producing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That has to be an attractive idea for a business. The only thing that I think will start to dissuade them is if it comes to a point where they realize that none of their customers have jobs anymore and no money to buy any of their products. It's not just the rigid tasks that are being automated. You've heard how journalism, comedy, complex board games that require human intuition and creativity and thinking are all being affected by this technology. And musicians as well. If you remember, Alex earlier on in the episode mentioned that a company in the UK is using AI to produce music for commercials. Well, every single piece of music you heard throughout this episode, including this one you're listening to right now and all the others, have been written, composed and put together by artificial intelligence music writing systems from jukedeck.com, the English startup that Alex mentioned earlier on. No human created any of the beats or the melodies or played any of the instruments. It was all done by AI and automated music software systems. And part of me feels I need to apologise for playing a hand in putting so many musicians out of work.
future for those who are prepared and make good decisions is going to be great.
It could be spectacularly good.
Technology has put us in this terrible situation where all these horrible things are happening, but it also is the only thing that can save us.
Everyone could have more than enough food and water.
There are way more jobs for people that are far beyond, simply oiling and maintaining the Terminators.
For me, this episode has been both fascinating and terrifying at exactly the same time. Maybe I'm getting things blown out of proportion, or maybe I'm not worrying enough. Let me know. P10 Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and hello@project10podcast.com is the email address. Also, all the links to the books used and the reports and the guests' bios and websites are up online at project10podcast.com also. Again, as I mentioned at the start, if you would like to support the series before the rise of the Terminators end us all, you can do so at patreon.com/P10 Podcast. Again, exclusive episodes before anyone else and extended content. Up there from this episode, Paul Roehrig explains his 5-step ahead model to survive and take advantage of the future of work, which is taken from his best-selling book. Again, thank you for listening. I do hope you've enjoyed it. And coming up on the next episode, we'll be exploring why people get offended. Is there a biological reason for it, and is it in fact a useful trait or a useless one? It's on the way in the next episode here in the Project 10 podcast series. I'm Cormac Moore, and I will speak to you soon.